Hi, everyone.
Good morning, Michael.
Hi, Benji.
Everyone.
Hey.
Good morning, good evening. Glad to see a bunch of folks here on time. I think there's a handful more that are on the attendee list, so we'll give it a couple minutes and see. I'm also going to keep an eye out for last minute pull requests. They happen.
Haley, for people who've been helping you or helping like merge pull requests, is there a specific order that we want to be following in terms of names, or is it fine to just do you and then first in first, like whoever's first is top of the list?
I tend to merge them as they show up just because it's easier to not have to like do the manual merge every single time. And then I usually sort them in alphabetical order. I used to sort them by alphabetical and organization, but I think that was too fiddly. So now I've just been raw, just like you can literally, I just open in the IDE, select all the rows below me and do alpha sort, and whatever it does, I roll with. That tends to work.
Lee, we don't have the live notes yet.
Oh, good call. Thank you. Let me set that up real fast. I need to make a script that just does this because it's, I'm sure there's a way to do that. It's literally just me creating a new shared doc in a folder in Google Docs every time. You know what we should really do is have a shared Google Drive for GraphQL Foundation, because a lot of this is just in a folder in my personal account, which is fine, but you know, probably not the right thing long term. It would also mean that I wouldn't be the only one capable of creating the docs, which would also be a good thing. Okay. Let me just post this in the chat so you can get to work. I'll put this in the agenda too. Thanks for highlighting that. Ooh, more pull requests. Let me get those in.
Since you're in there already, Lee, the
Yeah.
title for the April agenda is March. You might want to fix that.
Thank you. This is my copy paste development style peeking its ugly little head through. I almost made the mistake of editing that April 1 because it said March 2, so fell into my own failure. Okay, I think I've got all pull requests merged. Thank you for that. Updates in. So I believe our agenda is cleaned up, ready to go. And we are plenty of time over, so I think we got a very stable participant list. So thanks everybody for joining yet another working group meeting. To start off on our agenda, of course, by joining, we all agree to the membership agreement, participation guidelines, and code of conduct. You may have noticed if you sent pull requests up that we have a CLA bot that's now enforcing some of these things. Some of them failed. I merged those anyway, so we'd have an accurate record move forward. But please sort of treat those as a little bit of an asynchronous sign that you need to go clean something up. 1 in 3 odds that it's a bug in the CLA tool. So if you feel like you've definitely signed that thing before and it's showing up to you anyway, just flag it to me or let me know in Slack, and I can go try to make sure we get it cleaned up. So I've definitely noticed a couple of cases of that happening. With that, let's go through a quick round of intros. If you can reload and get an accurate view of the agenda, we'll just do intros starting from the top, work our way down in the order that they appear there. And if we miss anyone, then we'll intro you at the end, although I think we've got everybody here. So I'll start with me. Hey, everybody. My name is Lee. Here's your fearless leader.
Good morning, everybody. Here's Andy, doing GraphQL Java, working for Atlassian, calling in from Sydney this morning.
Hey everyone, I'm Benji, maintainer of the GraphQL suite of open source tools. And I'm also involved in pushing a few of the spec things forward today.
Hi all, my name is Evan. I work on GraphQL at Shopify, and I work on the GraphQL Ruby implementation.
I think you're up next, Yvonne.
Yeah, hi, I just joined, so always checking my position on the list. I help with GraphQL.js. And my name is Ivan, and I'm from Lviv, Ukraine.
John, I think you're up next. We can't hear you.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Hey, I'm John. I work at with Amazon Web Services on AWS AppSync.
Welcome.
Everyone. Hey everyone, I'm Mark. I work at Yelp on GraphQL stuff. I'm here interested today in Benji's conversation for operation expressions.
Hi, I'm Matt. I work at Facebook on client-side GraphQL stuff.
Hi, I'm Michael. I'm working at Chili Cream, and we're building the hot chocolate GraphQL server.
Hey, Morris here, work at IBM on a GraphQL proxy. I'm interested in several things today.
Hi, I'm Rob Grant. I joined Take Shape last month. Some of you may know my colleague Andrew Sprouse from past meetings. This is my first working group.
Hey everyone, I'm Sasha. I work on GraphQL at Twitter, and I'm super excited for some of the stuff today.
Hey, I'm Steven. I work on GraphQL Infra at Netflix.
I haven't added myself to the agenda yet. I'm doing that now, but I'm Gabriel McAdams, and I've been helping Yvonne with GraphQL over HTTP spec.
Excellent. And Rob, I see you there too. I just merged your pull request.
Did you actually want me to say something?
Intro yourself.
Yeah, I'm Robert with AWS.
Did we miss anybody? I think I might have gotten everyone. Awesome. Healthy crew. Thanks, everybody. Let's take a quick look over our agenda and make sure that we have everything here that we want to talk about. I'm going to give an update about new meeting times. We're going to go over our previous meeting action items. Then we've got replacing query errors with request errors from Benji. We will go deeper into alternate working group meeting times with Andy, and then talk about default value coercion rules, allowing fields to diverge, operation expressions, directives via introspection support, and an update on one of input objects in one of fields. That's a pretty healthy list of things to talk through. Anything that's not on this list that anyone wants to cover today? I like silence. That means we've got an up-to-date agenda. So first is just a quick update, and this is related to Andy's agenda. So I think I might jump to that one out of order after we get through some of these other things. But this one is mostly a heads up, and it was started by the first time Andy posed this of wanting to start to shift around our meeting times to be more amenable to the Asia time zone. So our next April meeting will happen 2 hours shifted, plus there's a daylight savings time shift that happens for many between now and then. So lots of things happening with dates and calendars that are confusing. So go check that out. I updated the link in that one to include more accurate time zones that the people who have been attending most frequently are closest to. So hopefully that's a worthwhile tool to make sure that you've got it appropriately represented on your calendar. I also made sure that it was updated on our Linux Foundation shared calendar. So hopefully everyone can see it there, but just want to make sure that if you manually enter this on your calendar, you got an opportunity to course correct so you show up at the right time.
The shared Google Calendar still shows the old time for me. I don't know.
Okay. I might need to update that. I know at some point we had 2 different calendars. So I thought I saw the one from Brian change, but maybe it's not represented correctly. So thanks for the flag. I'll follow up and make sure that gets fixed.
Okay, thank you.
All the more reason to let everyone know that it's changed.
Yeah.
Actually, do we want to just, Andy, do you want to talk about alternate times? I know you've got a sort of a broader view of what that could look like. Let's just pick that out of order and talk about that now, since it's relevant.
Sure, but there's not a lot of science behind it. It's just like the idea of having more suitable meeting times across the world, and it's kind of an unsolvable problem to some extent, right? Like you can't have a good meeting time for the whole world. So the rough idea was to kind of alternate between 3 or maybe even 4 different meeting times to kind of cover the world better. And I picked totally biased just to highlight the problem a little bit, like San Francisco, Berlin, New Delhi, and Sydney as representatives, and I put inside the working group issue 590, like there's a small table with 3 different meeting times suggested, which kind of covers the 4 areas better, I would say. Nothing is perfect, really. Like yeah, like I said, there's not a suitable meeting time for all, and if you want to, like the goal was that at least every of these 4 cities has 1 good meeting spot, and actually I kind of gave more preferable treatment to Europe and US, because most people coming from there. So it was the idea in this ticket is basically to have 2 1 meeting time which is good for San Francisco and Berlin, 1 for good which is San Francisco and Sydney, and 1 good for Berlin and New Delhi. That's basically the fundamental idea.
And I must say, Andy, it's even for Europe, yeah, all the 3 time spots would be okay. So I would be totally willing to be at the meeting at 11 in the evening, which is much better than your times, I have to say.
Yeah, actually Europe got away quite well with 6 p.m., 11 and 9 a.m. San Francisco has 2 very good spots with 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. and 1 very bad with 1 midnight. So it's like, it's really not, oh, these are the times, these are the times I think we have to choose. So it's more like a starting point for a discussion. But the fundamental idea is to have alternate meeting times to cover the world better. So yeah, happy to hear some thoughts.
So I think my first thought on this would be a great effort, and I certainly would like to make the GraphQL working group more accessible. But I wonder if having 3 or 4 meeting times might become a bit hard to predict for people. Like they're going to have to keep referencing their calendars to find out where it is. Would we be able to achieve similar goals by just having 2 meeting times that alternates? So, you know, if it's an even month, it's going to be the earlier call, or if it's an odd one, it'll be the later call, or something similar.
Well, just looking at the suggested times, you probably could make an argument that 2 of them would also be suitable for most of the world, yes. So if the idea is, if the concern is that too many meeting times is too confusing, I think 2 meeting times is already much better than 1. So if we, for example, say 2 meeting times, let's start with this, that also would be a great improvement in the right direction, I think.
I mean, probably a lot of it comes down to how willing or how frequently Lee is willing to wake up at the middle of the night to run a meeting.
That's actually a little bit interesting question. Lee, do you have to be at every meeting? Not that I don't want you to have here, but like, is this like a formal requirement just out of interest?
It's definitely not a formal requirement. And I was thinking as you were kind of proposing that a mode that we could run here is is to have like a main meeting and then satellite meetings at different times. And so, you know, you could imagine having a main meeting. You'd still want to make sure the main meeting was like reasonably accessible, but having satellite meetings that were much more amenable to like certain focus areas. And so you could have like the Asia Pacific specific meeting time and the Euro specific meeting time that would allow more people to attend to those, and then having sort of a delegate report back with anything that was meaningful could be one interesting way to take at this. But yeah, I certainly don't have to be at all of them. And if we wanted to run one that was sort of, you know, middle of the night for the US, but much more amenable time for Europe and Asia, then we just pick somebody else to run that particular meeting. That would be totally fine.
I have to say, I would be also okay with if Europe, but that's just me from Europe. If Europe is at one point later in the night, I see if I look at the first meeting, it's 4 a.m. in Sydney. I wonder if we just push Europe for one meeting more in the night, then it would be morning in Sydney, still good in San Francisco. And kind of okay for New Delhi. I think we could really do two meeting times.
Well, if you push 2 hours ahead and make it like the next meeting, Lee, will be 2 hours ahead of now, right?
Yeah.
So this is like actually I think okay for San Francisco, Berlin, and Sydney, but like kind of okay for Berlin with 8 p.m. But New Delhi is kind of in the horrible time zone at midnight. Like
That's
you kind
right.
of make it worse for New Delhi, you know.
Yeah, okay.
So this is the challenge of having one. I think is not enough. I think that the core
Yeah,
sentence
okay.
I'm saying here.
So, but I would be totally okay to have a meeting once. So every now and then having a meeting around midnight, I would be okay. I don't know how it's with Benji. You're also in Europe.
It would be a challenge for me because at the moment, due to lockdown and various other things, my computer room is in my bedroom. So I don't think the wife would be too supportive of that. I could probably find another place in the house. So yeah, I can make it work. It shouldn't be too much of an issue.
I took over the Lego room of my son, so but he's asleep at night.
Well, I want to make sure that we have a path forward. So my thought was that we just get a little bit experimental with some of the times. And another thing that we could consider is holding these meetings more frequently and having them be slightly shorter. So I actually scheduled the next one to be a 2-hour window of time rather than a 3-hour window of time. One, just recognizing that sometimes we go to a full 3 hours. Oftentimes we go short and we land at 2. And those typically feel like the most well-run meetings, in my opinion. So having like a firm time end might, you know, keep us on point on the agenda. Yeah, and 3 hours is a lot. So, you know, we could, doing them monthly, it makes them really easy to talk about and schedule because there's one every month, but we could do one every 3 weeks or 2 a month. And especially if we're going to alternate in a way where it gets much better for half of this audience and much worse for half of this audience. I imagine that's, even though some of us are saying that we'd make it work, you know, reasonably, it's going to affect attendance. And then also, like, we got to not forget that we've got a lot of East Coast US folks as well. And so I'd actually probably be okay to hop in a call at 11 p.m. or midnight my time, but that's, you know, 2 or 3 a.m. East Coast time. And I suspect that our New York and Boston members may not be willing to wake up at that time and join.
I'm maybe not as dedicated as Andy.
So okay, so then what about, as a concrete suggestion, like what about every 3 weeks, alternate meeting times, 2 hours?
Here's what I'm going to pitch. I think we should do, we've got our updated time for April. That's just shifted by 2 hours. So that at least it's still pretty early for Sydney, but it's at least not the middle of the night. Let's try that one. And then the following month, let's shift to afternoon, afternoon for the US time zone, which I think puts us in the danger zone for Europe, but is much, much healthier for the Indian and Asian time zones as an experiment. And we'll see what that does to attendance and see if it's functional. Because if we find that it's actually creating a drag force, then that's a sign that we'll want to increase frequency. And if it's actually works out fine, then you can make it work. But does that sound like a reasonable way to?
I think that's reasonable, but we might want to like have an explicit escape hatch of if there's not. So instead of trying to force people to attend in order to make it, like,
yeah,
if we find that there's not enough attendance, there's not enough agenda items, whatever, like explicitly say, hey, you can put stuff on the agenda, but say, I'm not able to make this time. And if there's enough of that, we'll just create a second one 2 weeks later.
Yeah. I think the other option here is that we create a satellite working group that is just in the prime hours for the Europe to Asian time zone. That's just the worst hours for the US, knowing that that's going to knock out the majority of the TSC. I think 2/3 of the TSC are in the US and Canada. But hopefully it means that we'll get dramatically better attendance from folks in Asia and India. And at least we'll have like Benji, Michael, you both have been at the meetings for a very long time, and I trust you to facilitate those. That's another thing we could try to do. We could have, working group 1 first of the month, working group 2nd of the month.
Sure, we can try that out and see how it goes.
I'd be happy to do that.
What do you think about that, Andy?
Yeah, sounds good. Like as a side note, can we use a little bit maybe our social media presence, especially on Twitter, to kind of announce this and make it a little bit more clear to people that we changed this? Like maybe send out a tweet at our Twitter account or so to see the effect of it.
Absolutely, that's a great idea. And I've got a whole backlog of news that I want to kind of share through those channels anyway, so I'll make it part of that whole set, because I believe as of today, actually, the thing that we voted on last meeting goes through, and so we're now legally in the clear to release a cut of the spec. So I want to announce that. And I've also been working on a grant program that I'll share details with y'all at a later date, but that's another thing I want to announce relatively soon. Okay, sounds like our action item for this one is set up a second April meeting that will happen later in the day for optimal times for London through Sydney. I can help schedule that, and we'll figure out the details. Mid-April, maybe.
Yeah, sounds good.
Sweet. Let's continue. Let's go through action items. I'm popping open this list. I tagged a bunch myself ready for review, so I'm getting better at doing these, although Benji is typically our champion of the action items. We have a lot actually that are listed up as ready for review. Let's see. Let me make sure that I'm filtering this down to only those that are open. Okay, we have 7 that are open. Should I present? I'll present my screen. Let's see here. Yes, just the Chrome window. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Cool. All right, let's work through these in order. So changing primary branch from master to main. This happened. We're on main. Hopefully that didn't cause too much confusion for folks as you're doing pull requests. This one is very clearly done. And investigate explaining what a request error is the first time we mention it. Benji, this is on your agenda for today's meeting, correct?
It is,
This
yeah, you can
done.
close it.
Most excellent. Open an issue to discuss expansions we might take atop schema coordinates.
That's also being discussed today. That's the operation expressions.
Aha.
So
That's
close
excellent.
it, yep.
Closed. Data collection techniques for finding a good set of times. I'm pretty sure that date time link is the best one. So I've marked it ready for review, and it proves that this is a hard problem. So we just talked about that. I'll close it. Examples of default values being used for arguments and input objects.
That's being, oh, I think we've had this open for long enough that, you know, as many people who are going to submit examples have done so. So I think we might as well close it now.
Great. Okay. We've got the information we can get. Value coercion. Advance through the RFC process. I unfortunately have not had a chance to review this, but I know we're going to talk about it. So thank you for your hard work, Benji. And this is the last one of cleaning up the GraphQL.js contributors list. This was added as ready for review, and I said I was going to do this, and I'm pretty sure I failed to follow through on this. So
yeah, I did that kind of today.
Oh, you did?
Yes, so I went through org members and remove everybody who is not in team, in any team. So basically, as we discussed, this issue was mostly about like people accounts that we got from Facebook during migration, not like accounts that was explicitly added because some reason. So since Lee, you set up like teams when we switch to foundation organization. So it's been like everybody who was added after that, they like belong to some team, and everybody who just like we get from Facebook had this zero team. So I just double check that we don't remove anybody who actively contributed, and I remove them. It was like something like 20 accounts.
Great. Worst case, if we mess something up, I'm sure they will bother us and we'll add them right back. But that's awesome. Thanks for getting it organized onto the teams. That was my intent in getting those started. So thanks for wrapping it up. That's great. We can close this. And reload just to make sure. Woohoo! All right. That one's smoother than any meeting before. I'll stop sharing my screen there. And next up, we are going to talk about Benji. I think the next one is yours, replacing query error with request error.
Yeah, cool. So we've discussed this before, and the stopping point was, well, we've got nothing in the schema that actually says, in the spec that actually says what a query error even is. So I have gone ahead and added a definition to this RFC. It's only a small paragraph, basically adds the basic details of it. We also link to it, I think, in the first place where it's mentioned. I haven't bothered linking to it from every case because I think that would just be a lot of markdown links and unnecessary. But broadly, I've also carefully gone over the changes to make sure that I'm happy with all of them. There's only one of them where I think there's like, it could go either way. So I've left that as is. But broadly, I think that this is ready to be merged into the spec if everyone agrees. So I'm proposing moving it forward.
I think that it worked excellent because now these ambiguities for query are reduced by introducing this terms request. We also did change the wording in our server to align that. So I think it's excellent.
Cool.
Where does the request errors? Am I just looking at the wrong thing?
So it's pull request 803 in the spec, and it's in section 7 as part of the response body.
Ah, I see it. I see it.
Because I figured request response kind of.
This is great. I think the one thing that we definitely should not block this. I'm really happy with this. I think we should mark it as approved, and I'll do a careful read and merge it after the meeting. Is we really need a section that just describes errors in general and the different kinds of them and how they work. And when we do that, we might either refer to the same section again or pull sort of this description into that section. Because there are more kinds of errors than just request errors, which I think was part of the rationale in making this clear. But this is a humongous clarification, so I really, really like this. I'm going to tag it up so that I don't lose track of it.
Awesome. That was all on this one.
Sweet. And there's no functional change here, so I don't know that we need to wait on a draft status or a pull request of any kind.
No
Maybe if
changes
there's
necessary.
Language in the reference implementations that say query error in some sense, might be worth just like a grep over that just to double check, but nothing that we need to block on, I don't think. Cool. Updated the tag. Great work, Benji.
Cool.
Any other questions on this one?
No, but there is interest in potentially pushing forward the idea of a glossary, which I proposed when I first introduced the concept of query ambiguity. In particular, I'd like to speak with you at some point, Lee, about how that would work within SpecMD, whether there is a thing that already works for it or whether we need to add a special syntax for it, whether it's just a new document at the end or whether we can link across the document to these keywords. So that, I mean, that would be, like the curly brace syntax, for example, for linking is really convenient. So if there was something like that we could do, that might be great. So just general mechanics of how we would actually do that.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. Manually building a glossary would be a pain and we're likely to get it wrong. So automating the creation of that would be great. And there's also some overlap where oftentimes something that we'd want to appear in the glossary is actually an existing headline. So I know that's going to make it a little bit confusing where the definition of some term is there. But I think that's very clever to like have formal definitions of terms as they appear so that you're not just reading flowery prose, but an actual term of art is appearing right now. That would be a very good clarification.
I think it would be really neat as well if we could, for example, hoist them a bit like tooltips almost. So as you hover over it, you can see it right there, as well as having an actual document at the bottom that you can read through in full. I think that would be really valuable. And SpecMD would be the place to do that, of course.
That's a really cool idea. Let's prototype it.
Is there any appetite for like standard error codes, like an error code field that go into the error body?
I think that's a compelling idea. I feel like we've talked about this before.
Yes, several times, I would say.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember the exact if it actually formed a proposal or not.
I think one of the things that we did was to make space for that error code by effectively, we made a change to the spec where we forbade any other properties on errors that weren't within the extensions property. So that effectively clears that namespace so that we could add code. I think we did that maybe 2 years ago, was it? It was quite a while ago.
Yeah.
But that should mean that we are now in a situation where we can add additional properties such as code to errors. So I'd certainly approve of someone working towards pushing that forwards.
Where it would be really valuable would be for the validation errors. If we had codes that then could link to the spec.
I mean, I know a lot of places already do it, add error codes in the extensions. And I think that works well enough that nobody I know has pushed for it just because that works well enough. And so it's not a major pain point right now, but it would definitely be nice to have them at the top level.
Yeah, I think we spent a lot of time recently trying to figure out how to like do error modeling, and the fact that we could have put error codes on the error objects directly was like a bit too subtle. I don't think we made that leap. That's really interesting to hear. Yeah, and as Evan says, it was just easier to do it in the extensions.
Yeah, I think if we put a code property on the error, we really have to put error codes to our errors in the spec, like the validation. Because if that is not done, then it's just another problem.
Yeah. I like this. The one thing I would suggest is just to think of error codes as a genre of solution rather than a tactical solve, and start with like what is actually the information that we want to portray in the error, and how might tools like GraphQL or Relay or Chili Cream or any of these others take advantage of those in a mechanized way. For example, I imagine seeing an error and wanting to be able to know programmatically that it is a validation error rather than a syntax error, like that separation would be very good. But then also if it's a validation error, then which specific validation rule failed would also be quite useful. I think I remember the last time we talked about this was in the context of doing a shared test suite. That was a project that got started long ago and never picked up steam, but would be a really incredibly valuable thing to have. And one of the things that makes it really challenging is that it's hard to know, like if you want to test that a particular thing fails validation, it's hard to assert that the way that it failed was the correct one. And some form of codes could be a really nice way to model the error states as expected.
I think Jaden, who's working on the test suite for the HTTP working group, has also expressed that it would be very nice to have code to test this kind of thing. I'd like to comment though that I think we're getting off topic and we've got a lot of things to cover today.
Yep. Agreed.
Actually, I have a small comment to the original discussion from Benji. Can we maybe highlight, like while I'm reading your pull request about replacing operation with request in general, I totally agree, it makes sense. But maybe we can highlight that a lot of people think about request in the like in the serialization format, they actually execute a request. So they think about a request in an HTTP request sense. And what we are describing here is actually a request after the serialization. And so, for example, that's also a topic about GraphQL, for the GraphQL over HTTP spec in the future. We treat errors which happen before the execution kind of different than errors that happen during the execution. So a request error inside GraphQL is different than a request error. Let's say the JSON body is not even well formatted. So it doesn't reach the engine at all. So maybe you want to kind of clarify with one small addition that it's actually a request after serialization, kind of a request for the engine.
There are also discussions in the HTTP group to even answer at this point with GraphQL response. It's not, I think, necessarily done like this, but you could also do that at this point.
Yeah, like I think there's a bigger discussion when we talk about GraphQL over HTTP, but for this spec edition, I think it's like GraphQL without HTTP, right? It's GraphQL without any specific serialization or transportation format. And I think we should highlight that request is not the actual HTTP JSON post request most people use.
Yeah, it's actually the GraphQL request, so the request to the GraphQL engine.
Yeah, this is what I call like
I completely agree with this topic. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the right word to use for this would be. And since request is already used in the GraphQL spec, and keeping in mind that the GraphQL spec broadly doesn't relate to HTTP or a transport in general, I thought this was, in the end, a sufficient term, and I couldn't find a better one. That said, I think it probably would make sense to add a non-normative note just to say, for clarity, a GraphQL request is, independent of, or not independent of, but like it's not the same concept as an HTTP request. I think there would be potentially value in saying that. I'm not sure exactly how to phrase that, but I think that could be done as a separate. Yeah. Agreed. I don't think we should factor in like terms like serialization into that note. But I think it could also be done as a separate thing because we already talk about GraphQL requests in this context.
Another potential option here is to call this an execution error. I know there's a distinction between the kinds of errors that should be known statically and the kinds of errors that you can't know until you run the query itself, or mutation or whatever, which is, I think, part of the original rationale for calling it a query error was that it happened during the course of running the query, but the intent here is to expand query to all of the operations. So execution error might be another way to term this.
Although Lee, it's a request error could also be a validation error and a parsing error.
Yeah, so this is why I want to have a section that specifically breaks down errors, and to Stephen's point, then like being able to codify that in a machine readable way later is a nice thing to have. But considering that we've already spent 15 minutes just talking about like what the hierarchy of errors is, makes it clear that this is something we need to map out. So, I want to keep moving on Benji's proposal here because the opportunity cost of doing it is super low, because I'm viewing this as a clarification since it's all non-normative. If we decide that we want to change query error to request error and then change request error to something that's even more clear once we figure out errors, we don't lose much. So unless anyone is thinking of something that I'm not thinking of, that's my mode.
I just want to add, I don't want to block this. I think it's a good addition, but a little bit more, like just a small sentence like Benji proposed would be great, because it's already confusing that people don't separate the serialization part versus the execution part. So like, let's not add on to this confusion. Try to make it clear at least a little bit more without blocking the effort.
Great point. Benji and I will make sure that we add that non-normative note before closing this out as part of the editorial process.
Thank you very much.
Okay, next up, Benji, this one is yours too. Default value coercion rules.
Yeah, so this was, and Andy had his earlier. I haven't managed to intersperse them, but like, yeah. Okay, so default value coercion rules. We've talked about this, I think, for the last couple of working groups, actually. I have attempted to advance this a little bit further. There was some complexity in the wording that I believe that I've now resolved. I haven't written a GraphQL.js pull request for this yet, because I think there's effectively two ways that the working group have considered that we could go. One is the way that I propose in this RFC, and the other one is just to do an additional amount of validation, I think, on the default values themselves, just because at the moment it just says it must coerce to, but that coercion could mean that the default value which we use uncoerced, could actually be invalid or like breaks the promises that we make. So we could just require that it's more than coercion. I personally am much more in favor of this one because I feel that the current behavior isn't right. I don't like it. I think it's inconsistent. And one of the things I really like about GraphQL is like the consistency and guarantees that it gives you. So to me, this is a glaring issue in GraphQL that I would like to fix properly. So codifying the existing behavior, though tempting in that it doesn't break anything, I think we could say that fixing it the way that I'm proposing is unlikely to break anything because anyone who has this issue will already have had to have dealt with it. That said, on the server side, it may introduce some overhead for people adopting the new versions of the GraphQL, like server-side implementations, because no longer will they be just using like, I think it's like native objects that you use rather than say the GraphQL representations, whereas we will be having to coerce those values now. So I'm not sure what that would mean for the various GraphQL implementations that are out there. That said, I believe that the terminology that I've used in the pull request is now valid. There's nothing hand-wavy going like, no infinite recursion, please. There is actually words to handle that correctly, I believe. They do need checking, of course, but I think that's all good. So I think this is ready. I'm a fan of this approach. But I'm also not willing to invest time writing the GraphQL JS for it until we sort of agree that this is the better approach of the two.
I'm trying to page back in where we were the last time we talked about this, which I think was maybe 2 meetings ago. Can you help me remember what the decision fork was last time and which of those we're following?
So the decision fork was basically, should we fix the validation rule on the schema that looks at the default values, and should we just say these default values must specify all of the relevant properties such that it can't be the case that, as I laid it out at the moment, that can't happen. And I think the general, like your thought, Lee, I think was broadly that you want the objects to be fully specified as the default values. You don't want things to be implied as part of them by default values on input object fields later.
There's a legibility win of not having to run the nested coercion in your own head when you're reading it. Yeah, that was right.
And I think that was the reason that we then requested information about various people that are using default objects and default object fields, basically to see whether that would result in particularly large schemas when we're reproducing this like redundant data. But I also pointed out that tools such as GraphQL that might expose this could absolutely do that completion themselves anyway. Like they have the information there, so they can do it. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an issue. It's basically when you write it, when you write it in SDL, do you have to fully write out every time? And there are people that write their schemas in SDL, right? So every time you add like a field in an input object with a default, do you then have to go through every single reference and add that into the default where that's used as part of an argument or something like that? And I personally don't think that that should be required. We considered then expanding and just having it like handled by tooling. And as I recall, Ivan raised the issue there that if you take an SDL schema, pass it to GraphQL, and then write it back out as an SDL schema, it should be able to be written out as the exact same thing as was read in. And if we were filling in the gaps for them, then that wouldn't be the case.
I mean,
Yeah.
in many other cases, we always go for readability rather than writability for the SDL. Or, I mean, we did this thing with the interfaces. The argument could be done there the same, that we could fill in the gaps, but we went for the approach to create more for readability than for writing the schema. And that would be, from my point of view, we should be consistent and also not just fill in magically things.
Well, I have to say that I am very much on the fence about whether listing everything out fully actually improves readability. Saying this has a default, which is the empty object, to me says it would be the same as if you pass the empty object. The fact that there are defaults there is the same if you were to pass those values yourself. So I think when you see all of the default values listed out, particularly if you have a lot of them, that can actually be quite overwhelming, and that overwhelmingness can actually reduce readability because it adds a lot more visual noise to what's going on. So I'm not completely sold on that argument, personally.
Yeah, I remember thinking about this a lot, and I'm landing where you're landing, Benji, that the principle of readability over writability, it's the right one. I actually think that where this is landing is aligned to that principle, in the sense that you should be able to read your query definition that tells you, what variables are required, and know fully what you can and can't send without having to go dig deep through nested documentation to figure it out. And the argument that you just made, Benji, I think is, in my mind, what made me convinced that this is the right approach, which is you should be able to look at the default value, copy that, put that in as the value for your variable, and get identical behavior, which in the logic that you're proposing here is exactly what would happen. And that does seem to pass the sort of readability test where it's doing that thing. And there are cases that you mentioned where there's optional fields that have some default value that is not actually particularly helpful to list out in a default value.
But should we make then the same argument for the interfaces?
I don't think so. Well, it's a little bit different, right? Because with the interfaces, it's about assembling the schema itself. Or maybe, what do you mean when you say that? Do you mean repeating?
Yeah, because we are repeating the interface implementation rules over and over again, which also can bloat. I mean, if you have a lot of interfaces, it would bloat your schema also. So the readability argument could be there also made that it could be actually improved readability if we have less, just to have a more consistent way to improve the SDL.
It's a reasonable point. I think there's a bit of a distinction there, just because interfaces are an inheritance hierarchy, which is a little bit more of a nefarious legibility problem, where if you see one interface that, especially now that you can inherit multiple interfaces, you could find yourself in a position where you have to crawl a fairly sophisticated hierarchy of interfaces to be able to know what fields can I query here, what's accessible, and the intent in requiring that you spell out the full shape of that interface was to remove the need to go crawling through the lists of documentation. I'm not sure that certainly the shape of this problem is similar, but I don't think it is quite as nefarious as the interface problem, where if you see a particular value in an object value that has default fields, you have to click through that anyway to understand the nature of the types of that field in there. It's more like crawling the hierarchy of types anyhow, as opposed to crawling an inheritance tree to figure out the definition of a single type. And I think I'm also remembering, Benji, the last time we talked about this, the realization that what we have here is very much a bug. And so we have to fix it one way or the other. And one of the bugs with the validation rules was that either we'd have to come up with a new validation rule for values, specifically for default values, to say like, this value is legal by ignoring all nested default values from here. And that ended up being some fairly complex logic in its own right. And so it's like, how complex was each path? And looking at, there actually is a relatively small change to the spec. And that's giving me the sense that this is actually the simpler solve. And that was my concern earlier, was that this was going to be more complicated. And I think your previous proposal had was like changing the way introspection worked so that you could get pre and post coerced values out of introspection, which it looks like you've omitted that from this current draft, which I'm a fan of.
I don't remember whether that made it into it, but we certainly discussed the possibility of that. So yeah, this is as simple as I could get it, I think, pretty much.
Well,
I'd also like to point out on the readability point of view, there's nothing in this that prevents people from expanding those and even writing GraphQL validation or linting rules that would say, hey, you've not added these fields to the default, but they're going to be applied. Why don't you add them in? So it's something that if the ecosystem feels is an important thing, it can be added by the people that implement the GraphQL schema. But I don't think that it's something that we have to, as the spec, enforce that particular behavior. We just need to make sure that it's valid. And that's the problem that I'm trying to solve at the moment.
The second issue that you said, what Ivan essentially pointed out, so with printing it out the same way. So in order to do that, you need to then essentially, if you at the moment would take in this reduced set of SDL and the server would complete that, you would get another schema out of the server. Is that...
No, this doesn't make any change to the schema or to introspection of the schema. It is literally a change to execution effectively. So it's written as part of the coercion rules, so that effectively the input gets coerced, the default value gets coerced at runtime, but effectively that can be memoized, so you can actually do it at schema build time and then store it into a separate thing, but it's just a memoized value. It wouldn't ever come through introspection. So no, it doesn't affect any of those things. It's fine. It's the same behavior as it has currently.
That's actually one thing that I think we should explicitly call out in a non-normative note, is that most service implementations should memoize the coercion of default value.
How would you do that? So I've put a note in, as you'll see at the bottom of the pull request, saying this is memoizable, but I wasn't sure where to put that note. I considered putting it like inline here, but inline in a bulleted list seemed wrong. And further away from here, I just couldn't work out the right place to put it.
You'll notice that in the two places within section 6 that you had to make an edit, there are already non-normative notes below both of those algorithms. And I'd probably put it in both of those. And you can literally just repeat it in both. And in fact, those two algorithms are almost exactly the same as one another, which maybe one day we'll figure out how to reconcile them to be the same algorithm. But that's probably the right place to put those.
So if you memorize these default values, if you memorize objects, they could be because they could be they could be mutable objects in some languages, and if you memorize them, then you could run into issues where you get something injected in your resolver and then mutate on that, and then you actually mutated the memorized version of the object, where I think it's if we coerce every time the default value, we are protected for that. From that.
Yes, I think that's why that would be a non-normative note, right? It's effectively an optimization. It's an optimization that if you believe that your GraphQL implementation is not going to fall foul of, then by all means use this optimization. But otherwise, just do it like the algorithm itself has you do it every single time.
Awesome.
Yeah, that sounds right to me.
Just to clarify on that, it's not a big issue anyway, since we do memoization of coercion right now for arguments, because if you have array lists, you repeat resolver for every item of a list, and inside the resolver you have access to like IST and to coerce values. So if we coerce every time for every item in array, it will kill performance. So we need to memorize. We already memorize inside in context of requests, just like a change that we will have memorization in context of schema. But yeah, we need to trust clients, like API clients, to well behave, or we just cannot reparse every stuff for every individual resolver.
Okay, but so how I meant this, so how we actually do it, we have the literals as an object, so we don't pass them. And we use these literals to compose from them the actual runtime values. That is not the impact then if you would pass that. We memorize for immutable stuff like strings in .NET are immutable, ints are immutable. We can do that. But for many objects, you cannot memorize them. The second thing here is that it's input values we're talking about. So in most things, you don't have like huge trees of input graphs that you coerce, or at least in the schemas that we see. So it's not that much of an impact, like if we were talking about output data that always have to be passed. But yeah, I agree. Memorize where possible would be my note.
Okay, it seems like we're in reasonable agreement that this is the right path. Am I reading the room correctly? That aside from having the note here about getting the memoization opportunity correct, it's the right way forward. Cool.
One thing I have, like, yeah, initially I was kind of for alternative approach of just validating values instead of coercing them. But yeah, I agree. It's like, it's also not ideal, but it's sort of ticking more boxes in a sense. And in a sense, yeah. So, but I have a question. So it's basically just not a question, even like a note that we all aware that it basically means there is like a bunch of different representation of the same value inside like introspection. So for example, like Coercion rules allow you to pass one value instead of list, or it allows you to pass number instead of ID. So default representation of ID is a string, but you can pass like a number instead of ID. And other like it's not only like default fields, default input fields. It's also like other Coercion rules.
That's just for the taking a non-GraphQL literal value, a runtime value. So we do that as part of the Java JSON to to GraphQL.
No, it's also inside literals. Inside literals, it's the same Coercion rules, both for like literals and for JSON values. And we have like literal and value. Yeah, so Coercion rules apply to both. They're the same. You can pass.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I think this might be a quirk where the coercion rules apply to both, but there's a validation rule on literals that require, like if you say string, you can't pass a number. The validation rule should reject that.
No. Yeah, like you can, but if you specify ID type, ID scout type, you can pass. I meant that. So like ID for ID type, default representation is string, but you can also pass numbers. So basically, just note it's not like argument. It's argument against, but I still think it's best solution we can come. Is that like inside insert introspection? Basically, you can pass. Imagine like we have list of IDs as a input field. So as default value, we can put like a list of one string. We can put single string, or we can put like a number. So we can put like square braces and quotation 5. We can just put quotation 5, and we can put just 5. And basically it's the same, and they mean the same, but inside introspection we will probably to keep SDL reversible, meaning like you put SDL and you get the same SDL for introspection. We will keep the stuff that person specify inside the SDL,
right?
And it's mean like so like.
I think that's already, that's either a new surface area of bug that is solved by this proposal.
No,
I think it's an argument for continuing to do this, right? Or maybe I'm misunderstanding, but either way, I want to make sure we have time for the rest of the stuff. Let's get like examples written down. So okay, 2 actions I want to propose out of this. One is one that I just did, which I'm advancing this from proposal to draft, since it's now in a state where we think, other than non-normative stuff, this is the right thing. But also we have to go make sure that when applied against reference implementation and other implementations, that we don't find something that we've forgotten. And Yvonne, it sounds like you're pointing out a specific edge case that we want to make sure we have tests for and is exhibiting the behavior that we expect. And if it's not, then we should circle back and make sure that we have reasonable behavior. Next up is Andy, field divergence.
Okay, let me link the issue. Just a little bit explanation. It's more about getting some feedback. So if you open the issue, one of the most complicated validation rules we have is about overlapping fields, which basically allows you to kind of repeat fields. Well, let me phrase it differently. It allows you, it doesn't force you to make sure that every field is unique in your query, right? Especially if you have it like composed queries across a UI, you can't even do this. So GraphQL lets you, GraphQL lets you repeat fields all over, and the engine has now the unthankful job of merging them together and making sure that the field is only executed once. And this is the whole purpose of the overlapping field rule, to make sure that this merging can be actually done. You want to add something, Lee, or is this correct?
This sounds right.
So, and one corner case, actually you merged it previously, like way back in times, like in November 2015, was that we loosened these rules for object types which can't be realized at the same time. So if you look at the example query in the beginning, you have like pets, and cat and dog is like a concrete pet, and it can be at runtime, actually it can be only a cat or dog. So this is why the above query is correct, or not correct, it's like valid, because you can't have a cat or dog, so it's totally okay to have a friend which is actually cat friend, and for cats, and you have a friend which is a dog friend for dogs, even if the result key, like the value in the response, is friend, the actual type of it is different, and that's okay because it's cat or dog. I hope this makes somehow sense. That's a little bit like it wants validation rule, to be honest. And so, but now we have another edge case. If you scroll further down in the issue, that you have pets again, and you have a cat or dog. This is like the second query example in the description of the issue. You have value, which is a cat value or a dog value, and which are scalars, not like complex objects. And this is now not allowed anymore, because the current rule says cat value is not equal to dog value because one is int and one is float. So this is rejected. And kind of my question is like, are we sure that this is what we want? And if we are sure, can you explain it to me a little bit?
This discussion was already, I think, Sasha from Twitter also wanted to explore if we could allow that. I remember, and Lee pointed out that it was originally introduced because of their client generator back in Facebook, I remember.
What was introduced, like the pull request, which loosened the restriction, or still the scalar restriction?
No, the restriction that field cannot have different types, like in the type cases.
Well,
but it was open to explore if that is, I think the essence was we are open to explore if we should loosen that further. But there was no decision.
I think the next step, so the next step was to like try to come up with an RFC to see how this could work and if it would be okay, because I think the reason we wanted to change it was because a lot of client folks would have to alias these fields, which can become like really, really tedious. So we thought if we can come up with an RFC and see like, you know, if it is worth doing and if it isn't, you know, too much of an issue, then we could move forward with it, which I have not done. Things get busy, but I think that's where it was left.
Exactly. That's how I remember it.
So just to be clear, like why I poked around a little bit, I feel it's very inconsistent at the moment. So I'm not sure. Just like it's not just about losing something to allow more. It's a little bit we already allow quite different response shapes for the same name, but at some cases we don't do it.
So I can speak to this, given I am probably the person that has to deal with the code base that currently still is restricted by this problem. So basically, taking a step back, when GraphQL was first introduced at Facebook, we did it via something called type models, which basically models generated match the schema very quickly. We found out that that was like a terrible way to do models on the client. And the models that we've been operating with for the last 6 years mostly have been what we call response models, which are basically, if you look at the JSON response, we generate models that exactly map what the fields in the JSON response are going to give us. So like a JSON object is kind of a generic thing. It's okay if there's two underlying different like object types, but it's not okay if a field ever could resolve, if field in the JSON at the same point, at the same level, could ever resolve to either an integer or a float. Because like in Java, when you generate a model, you can't generate a model unless you have, like, in that case, you generate a pair or something like that. And that doesn't, and I responded with, if you scroll down, I responded with the exact interface that we at Facebook basically would generate for this query, and why it's impossible for us given our response models. That being, and even Relay currently has this problem with their, like, component-based models, like the TypeScript types that they generate would also have this problem.
They have problems with aliases anyway, or Relay.
I mean, you basically have to use aliases in order to solve this.
Yeah, that's to maybe recap the critical issue and the rationale for this original constraint is, if you follow any path through the resulting payload, you should statically know exactly what type that thing will give you. And designing off the limitations of Java and Objective-C, which is where the original clients for these were built, is it is okay for something to be of some type or null, but it's not okay for something to be of two separate types. That's modern type systems account for this, right? You can have it in TypeScript or Kotlin or Swift. You can say this is int or float, and you can write code that is safe against that, but it is harder to write safe code against that kind of thing in older languages. So that's the reason why for an object, you know, it doesn't actually matter that that object is a high-level GraphQL type of a cat or a dog. It just matters that it is a object shape that has fields in it, and those fields also have to match. So the one that you mentioned in the chat, Evan, the on a cat narrowing down to some field and a dog narrowing down to some field, as long as some field are both the same serialized type, that should validate. If they're different serialized types, then it should fail for the same reason that it would fail one level up.
Okay, even though the type switch of the type fragment switching is now like 2 layers up in the query, it still will do that cross validation.
Yeah, because you should be able to say pets friend some field and then know that that's string.
Yeah, that was what I was wondering, whether we covered this case or not, or whether there's already like a place where we weren't covering this.
Yeah, this is why this validation rule is one of the slowest ones.
Yeah, because it has to cascade the knowledge down through the levels.
That's actually the original use case why I come down with this performance, but that's another topic. But actually, the example I gave in the issue is you have, okay, just to recap that I understand correctly, like in a high level sense, if you look at the first example again, I pasted it in the chat also. If you look in the first example again, it's a little bit different from what Evan wrote. It's like friend, you have friend, cat friend, friend, dog friend, and actually the childs are different. So the cat friend has cat friend name and dog friend has dog friend name. Okay, and this is also valid at the moment. So, and just to be clear,
this is valid because in both Java and Objective-C and most other older languages, they have a nullability representation. So they can say the resulting payload will say you have pets, and then on pets you'll have a field called friend, and on friend you'll have 2 fields, cat friend name and dog friend name, both of which are nullable. As opposed to a more modern type system might instead want to represent that, and I think Relay actually does this, of saying that your pet's friend field is going to either be an object with a single property cat friend name or an object with the single property dog friend name, and then represent the types of those correctly if they happen to be non-nullable. But for an older, less sophisticated type system language, those would get merged into one response payload, which I think most GraphQL Java and GraphQL C and GraphQL Objective-C still generate their model responses that way.
We, like at Facebook, we have a solution for this. If we like all new code that we're writing solves this in Java and Objective-C, but we've got like this giant corpus of code that can't. And in order to solve this, we have to inject type name everywhere. But.
So if I'm remembering correctly from a few months back when Sasha brought the same problem up, the thought process out was, if this validation rule is yielding net negative value for the vast majority of modern clients, which are TypeScript and Kotlin and Swift, then we should look at evolving this. And in doing so, you know, we wouldn't want to create backwards breaking work. So presumably you would take the old version of that validation rule, transform it into a lint rule, which operates the same way as a validation rule, but are optional. I think we have a couple examples of those, Matt. Is that right? You have your like GraphQL linter engine.
Yeah, well, on the client, we actually add a ton of extra validation rules. So we have like Facebook specific validation in addition. So we would, I guess what you're saying is, for Facebook, we would take the lint or optional or like for old clients validation rules, we take it.
Yeah. So Relay has this, right, where there's some things that are technically valid GraphQL, but are not valid Relay GraphQL, where Relay is slightly more strict in scenarios where it wants to generate smarter models or do something. And I can imagine a future where core GraphQL becomes more lenient in this way, but tools like Relay or like Facebook's other internal tools represent the same sort of constraint, but as an additive thing as part of that tool rather than as a core thing of the library itself. That could be reasonable. My hesitation with it is I want to make sure that we're representing that problem correctly, that it is purely these are the oldest systems and they're the only ones that suffer this constraint. And therefore this is a safe thing to do for the rest of the GraphQL ecosystem. But if we find that there's like actually a lot of stuff across the ecosystem that would end up being broken by expanding this, then we'd want to pump the brakes.
I think in order to do that, we'd need to make a strong recommendation somehow that like new clients that get built do not use response models.
Well, response models are okay. They would be ambiguous in older languages. They would be clear. Like if you're writing a response model in TypeScript and you've got the second query that Andy wrote, then you would just say pet's value is int bar float, and that would be an appropriate response shape.
Yes, but this only works because like TypeScript kind of is actually JavaScript and untyped at runtime. For languages that require to be typed at runtime, you would need to introduce into your parsing like a look back mechanism, because
I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying.
Honestly, I'm very happy with the explanation that you gave in terms of it improved a lot my understanding for the restriction. So, and I was not aware that Sasha already brought this up in a previous meeting. I could not find anything about it.
Yeah, I still think it would be a great thing to explore because it would open up some things. And I don't think it's bad to if a client rewrites the initial query from the user and puts their type names in to do that distinction. So I think it still adds value, or it could add value to clients. So it would be great to explore that.
Yeah, this restriction is narrowing it down so that we guarantee that GraphQL responses can be well typed by lots of painfully subpar type generators. And it would be nice to expand it to say, if you want to use your subpar type generator, then you should restrict what kind of queries you allow. But otherwise, let's leave room for more sophisticated response type generators to exist that have better developer experience. So that's the rationale that I like on why we should kind of keep on this. recognizing that it's a little bit non-obvious. But in the meantime, I think a reasonable action item is to just add a little bit of prose for this particular validation rule in the spec that illustrates a little bit more of the rationale for why it's there. I think we probably don't have that. And especially since this one is quite complicated, it's easy to miss the forest for the trees and kind of follow this really complicated validation rule and be like, wait, why the hell are we doing this in the first place? So reasonable action item.
Yeah, like to highlight this, in this specific validation rule theory, there comes like the two different constraints into place, that you want to have a clearly executable one with a clear type response shape. I think this combination, which forces this validation rule, makes it so hard to understand. So adding a little bit prose to it really would be really great. Cool. I would be happy to help to write it, also review it. So yeah,
that would be awesome. Happy to collaborate. Okay, let's keep going. Operation expressions. Benji, this is yours.
Sorry, for the notes, could you clarify what the action item was exactly?
Add prose or non-normative note to the this particular validation rule. I don't remember the name of it, but
overlapping field can be merged. I'm not sure this is real name. But this
thank you. That's probably the right one.
Okay, lovely, thanks. All right, switching from note mode. Where are we? What are we looking at now?
Operation expressions.
Operation expressions. Okay, cool. So as you'll know, Mark has been proposing his schema coordinates RFC, which I think is excellent and I definitely support as it is. One of the things that I was interested in from the beginning is to see how this syntax that Mark has come up with, or really has noticed that everyone is already using and gone, let's make this a standard, how that could be expanded for other use cases. So we've talked about this in previous working groups. I've discussed how I've talked about it with, for example, Danielle Mann from Apollo and various other people to see what the various use cases of this are. My main motivation for bringing this up at the working group is not to analyze the syntax that I've come up with. It is instead to gather more use cases. And this document was originally gathering use cases, but I got a little bit carried away and I came up with a syntax that works for all of the current ones. Do not constrain yourself by this syntax. Also, I apologize for this syntax. Basically, the aim is to understand what other things we might want to build on top of the schema coordinates RFC, just so that we know that we can say, yes, the schema coordinates RFC is great, let's merge this in, like, let's make this an official thing, and then not regret it later. So where this is relevant, for example, is, and we've resolved this already, but I want to raise it anyway. We discussed before about, for example, arguments on fields within a type could be referenced as type.field.argument, or they could be referenced with type.field parenthesis argument and then optionally a colon. And there's a bunch of different syntaxes that were proposed as part of the schema coordinates RFC. We settled on the parenthesis with the colon, and I'm happy with that. And I want to show how that gives us more possibilities. And had we have gone with periods, we wouldn't have had the option to do these things. But I would also like the opportunity to see if there's any other things that this might be limiting us. So one example might be, for example, namespaces. I know there's people that are currently trying to push forward the idea of having namespaces in GraphQL. And a period would make a lot of sense to use for a namespace. It would be consistent with various implementations in various languages. Obviously, we could use any other symbol. But if we decided that a period is what we want to use for namespaces, then using the period in the schema coordinates may not be so desirable. So broadly, if you've got stuff that might be able to make use of the schema coordinates syntax, but in a broader, in a wider use case, please tell me what your use cases are. To give you some ideas, I've outlined some use cases that we've discussed previously in this document. So one is, for example, referencing a position within a GraphQL operation document. So you've got your GraphQL query that you've written and you want to reference a specific field within that. And that might be within fragments. It might be within all sorts of other complex things. How would we write a path, for example, that specifies that exact thing? Another thing that I came up with was you may or may not be familiar with Emmet, which is a way of building HTML documents quickly by writing out effectively CSS classes and having them autocomplete. I proposed that we might use a syntax such as an extended syntax from schema coordinates to build documents or potentially schemas using this kind of syntax. So that's another potential use case. Another thing is, for example, document permalinks and generally just linking within documentation to parts of like a query. Or in, for example, graphical, as you're in graphical browsing through, you might say like, oh, I want to look at the query object, and then I want to look at this field, and then I want to look at like the connection payload type on that, and then the edges and the node, and you've navigated through a big chain of things. Could we represent that in the URL in a standard format? And I figured that using the schema coordinate syntax here with maybe some separators could be valuable. Linking within the documentation to how you might reference an actual field in a query, because obviously not all fields are at the root level and you might have to go through a particular path, or there may be many paths to get to that field. Also, analytics was one I came up with. So like counting how many times particular fields are used and what path they were used via. A lot of the things that I've come up with are path-based, and I'm not saying that this has to be constrained to path-based. If you can think of other things, great. But yeah, these are the ones I've come up with. And as it happens, I've actually used this syntax whilst writing the notes for the previous section. So if you're looking in the live notes, I'm just going to bold an entire section here. But there is a reference where we were discussing the path through a document, comparing the cat friend name and the dog friend name, and this syntax allows us to represent that. So again, that was a lot of information very quickly, sorry about that. But broadly, I want to gather use cases. I want to know if there's other things you can think of that a syntax like this might be useful for, or that we might want to build on top of schema coordinates. I'll stop talking now.
I want to back up and make sure I'm understanding the problem being solved in the intent. Is the intent to go broad and explore all possible future use cases such that we can make smarter decisions about syntax choice in future proposals? Or is this specifically about adding something to the GraphQL language to solve a specific problem?
It's the former at the moment. It may become the latter, but at the moment, it's just broadly to make sure that whatever we decide on for the schema coordinates RFC is not something that we're going to regret later.
And are you asking for like specific use cases right now, or are you just kind of raising awareness and pointing us to the doc?
If you've got specific use cases right now, I'd love to hear them. But yeah, otherwise, by all means, like a pull request to the doc or something like this. I don't know whether it would make sense to merge this as a really early RFC so that other people can raise pull requests against it potentially.
Yeah. So I'll give this as a comment as well, make sure that people are aware of this, but I just had two super small thoughts. Number one is, well, first of all, it looks great. So thanks for extending this. Thanks for doing this. It looks amazing, and definitely solve some of the like comments that people had the schema coordinates doc. So this is definitely needed. So one thing I was thinking of is like, would relative expressions be possible, because I was thinking for like when you're deprecating a field and you put like a little deprecation notice, like use this field instead. I can imagine some sort of like tooling to auto generate that message for you if you're like renaming a field or something. But then you want to do like a relative expression. So I don't know if that's like supported.
That's definitely within scope. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and then the other one, my other thought was just to like bike shed for a half a second. Not really bike shed, but just something that came up with the schema coordinates thing. We landed on the just dot separator for everything pretty much. And this was brought up by, I believe, Ivan, and I didn't kind of like appreciate it. I didn't appreciate it at the time as to why it would be a problem. But when I went to do the GraphQL JS like function implementations to generate the AST, it made it much harder having the single dot separator for AST purposes. So I think like visually, like as humans, the dot separator and the greater than arrow separator that you use in here, I think makes sense as a human, but it may make the like AST functions slightly harder. But that might be a trade-off worthwhile. Just kind of wanted to give you a heads up.
Cool, thanks for the heads up.
Just a follow-up question. Because like use case for specifying alternative fields to use, or just referencing like inside description referencing other fields, it's like compelling use case. But I thought schema coordinates was enough for that. So like I can just say, instead of this field, please use type name dot new field.
Yeah, so you raise that is a particularly interesting question. And I think one of the reasons that this is valuable is, for example, if you have a root level field on the query object and you deprecate that and you want to say instead use user.name or something like that, that's great. It tells you what the name is, but it doesn't tell you how to get it. Like if there was a thing, if you had, for example, at the root of your query something that said current user name, and you said go and see user.name, that's like, great, that's a user's name, but how do I get me? How do I know what my current user's name is? So showing what the path through the GraphQL to replace a field is could be valuable.
For non-trivial, for like big non-trivial like changes, if it's like deep, I don't think we can do it like syntax that cover everything. I think like if it's like if it's sublinks, so like you just rename a field and just want to specify another one, schema coordinates is enough. If it's like whole type was renamed, it's also kind of enough. We just move. But if it's something major, you need probably to provide sample query anyway, or link to like better documentation, because it's like big change. Yeah,
right. And this syntax would support that in a concise format, potentially.
One thing I'm kind of worried is like I think having like special syntaxes should be restricted to only if it's improve developer experience. So for many things, for returning stuff inside the introspection, or for like returning stuff inside errors, we can use like just structures. But special syntaxes are good if it's like intended to be consumed by users directly, or users need like to have like pattern recognition. That's why schema coordinate is like it's used in many places. So people already starting recognizing it. It's used in graphical, Apollo tools use them. So I think it's worth to standardize and it's worth to have special syntax. But for like more complex stuff, I'm not sure that like it's like I'm not sure we need to invent developer experience.
Well, let's that's part of why I asked what the intent and goal is here. Is I want to make sure we focus on that. And if the intent and goal is let's expand broadly so we can make smarter syntax decisions on current proposals, then I guess my question is, now that you have done this exercise, do you feel more or less confident that the schema coordinates is making the appropriate decision? Or is that the right question to ask that you're trying to answer?
Yeah, I having done this, I have not found anything that invalidates the current path that we're taking with schema coordinates, which is part of the reason to broaden it further and see if anyone else has got any ideas. But yeah, it has made me much more confident with the schema coordinates. There is potentially a question over directives, but for the other parts, I'm perfectly happy.
That's great. I'm super happy to hear that, because I'm with you, Yvonne. There's like, if we're going to bend this in the direction of actually taking some of these explorations and adding them to the spec, we'd want to apply a much more careful eye of critique and make sure that we start with the problem and look through all of our options. But certainly as a syntax exploration and various potential things we want to do in the future, I like that this as an exercise in the direction of clarifying that we're making the right call on schema coordinates. So I'm happy to hear that this is improving our confidence with that.
So in response to what you were saying, Ivan, this is effectively already in use in the Apollo Studio, the Apollo GraphQL Studio. So when you're navigating through the documentation, they already indicate the different like types that you're going through, the fields that you're going through, and they even use like the greater than symbol as a separator. Now it's obviously a CSS styled separate bits with clickable links, but it is already in use for describing these things. And these use cases were, some of them were inspired by the discussions that I've had with Danielle about this. So these are definitely things that are use cases. They're not just like pulled out of the air trying to come up with use cases for it. It's very much, these are things that people are doing, like wanting to be able to represent a state within graphical is something that we want to do. Wanting to represent how you would find a particular field through the GraphQL tree, rather than just saying it's this field on this type and then not knowing how to get there. That is a pain point that Apollo actually made a point of saying, we show you like the shorter routes to get to that field because it may be relevant. And having a nice syntax for doing that, a consistent one, I think has value. So there is definitely use cases for that, but that is not the current purpose of me being here today.
Okay, so a suggestion, because I think like it would be so like I think it would be less question and more collaboration if we have like these use cases inside documents. So like maybe even screenshot from Apollo Studio showing how it's represented there. And maybe other authors will contribute similar stuff. So less like trying to generalize, more like we have like these use cases right now.
Yeah, absolutely. When I'm looking to push this forward for that use case, I will definitely do much stronger convincing that those things are things that are desired. But that's not the purpose of this at the moment. I just want to get the schema coordinates merged, and I want to make sure that we're confident in doing so.
This does give us more confidence in schema coordinates, so I think this has been helpful for that purpose. What is schema coordinates in isolation is not on our agenda, but do we need to look at that and consider it stage?
The last time we spoke about it, it's stage, is it stage 1 or 2 right now? I can't remember, but turn my phone off, sorry. The last time we spoke about it, I think you wanted me to add some functions to GraphQL.js to do the like AST parsing and serialization and stuff. And I kind of haven't had a huge amount of spare time the last recent issues of various things. But I am going to focus back on that relatively soon. I don't know if that's still blocking the like stage advancement if we're like super confident on the schema, but I'll leave that to you.
I think last time we talked about this, it was about getting the spec text in a clarified place, and I believe that you did that. I don't think we ever moved the label to represent that and be accurate to the next steps. So this is definitely draft, not proposal, and you are correct with the next steps there of making sure that there's representation in the reference implementation. So I just made sure that I updated the tag on that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I'll this has been a helpful exercise.
I was just reading through the chat, and Marc-Andre raised that building, for example, selection sets, like to select schema members. That is definitely something that I would like to consider as well. It may not be part of the syntax that I've proposed in this document, but again, that's not the point of the exercise. That may be something that we want to consider, see what that might end up looking like. To see if that is a match for schema coordinates. So yeah, thank you, Marc-Andre. I appreciate that.
Good point. Let's keep going. Introspection or directives via introspection support. Andy, this one's yours.
Hey again. It's between me and Benji today, it seems. Yeah, so there's this, I'm not sure if this is a famous, but it's a well-known issue 300 in our GraphQL spec, which was created by Oleg, who's unfortunately not with us anymore, but he raised a very interesting and still valid point that, well, directives are not introspectable. Like you can get directives which are supported by the engine, but you can't find out, for example, that a field has an add important directive by introspection. And like there's a big discussion over the years, and I'm not here to start all of the discussion again. It's actually too much to read even. I just want to highlight that recently GraphQL Java has implemented, well, did we merge it? I think we are about to merge the ability to query directives via introspection, and we actually aligned our design with the GraphQL.net implementation. So we have now two well-known implementations exposing directives via introspection, and the design itself is actually allowing to kind of push this forward. And it's more like an announcement I'm doing here. It's and we can talk about specific things, but the actual design is also not so important. But I think it's still a missing point in our ecosystem. That's my overall sentence I want to say. Yeah.
The one issue I see there is that we should at least publish. So we copied from. So we are implementing it at the moment also, and we copied it from your issue over the schema and stuff. Well, there should be some specification for this still, where you can grab if you want to follow that you can grab the thing. The one thing I think is a bit of pity. I like the former design more, where you have these extensions and actually can have an extension point in your introspection. And I think that was also the way originally Ivan was going, that you have a point extension where you can also put other type specific data or custom data there.
Yeah, like
this is,
sorry, we can still have an extension point, but for this specific directive, yeah, like we in GraphQL Java choose to align with GraphQL.net because we didn't want to fragmentize the ecosystem. So I know your argument. I understand maybe extensions would have been nicer, but overall we choose to align ourselves to not have different versions. And yeah, I agree that a document would be nice. We have not written it yet. And
yeah, we are still, that's the reason why we follow you, so that there are more there is more implementations that follow the same thing, and we don't actually end up with a couple of different approaches to that. But we should at least write a RFC or something like that. We could also help on that. I mean, if you want to share work on that. But we should.
I didn't know that you ought to do it. So that's great to hear. So yeah, I'm happy to write a quick document or so where we kind of outline an informal spec where people can follow up on this. Yes.
Yeah, it would be great if we put that like I mean, we have the stream RFC. If we create some RFC, it's not in the spec, but it at least is one point where people can follow things like that, and then it can evolve there. That would be great.
I'd love to see that.
The thing is, like, I will probably not have the time and energy to tribe the topic completely. I just want to shout out. Yeah.
That's why I say I'm willing to help you there, and I think I don't know his name, Sungamer or so from GraphQL.net would also, I think, chime in there. So we would have multiple people that could do work there, but that we initially have one point where we all can go and put the information.
I think that would be great if we collaborate on this. That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Like, question to the room: do you know more implementations of this across the ecosystem? Like, I think somebody asked in the chat if it's in Ruby. Do we know? Does anybody know other languages to support?
GraphQL Ruby allows you to add additional fields inside introspection, but they don't expose directives. One thing, I added extension to types in GraphQL.js, and initially people was kind of against it, but I communicate the reasoning why, and I still stand by them, that like directives have like short and nice names, but like plus they're connected to SDL, so in a major way, and so I think from GraphQL.js users, I convince like people to start using extensions, and they use more and more, and they attach to types. But as you write, they're not exposed through introspection. And now I see how big this problem is. So right now we like kind of in domino situation. So one domino failed.
Yeah. Let's definitely get an RFC assembled so we can start collecting the various implementations and reconciling. One thing that I would very much like to see is a problem-oriented approach to the RFC. Exposing directives through introspection is a solution. I want to make sure that that is a solution of many solutions that we can choose from that solves a problem that we want to solve. Especially since just raw exposing directives through introspection could yield a bunch of side effects that we don't want. Like if you have a directive that's purely for internal consumption only, and now it's exposed through introspection, you need control over whether that happens or not. We also don't want to just like roll this out and then suddenly expose everyone's internal directives on their schema out through their customers if they were not intended to be exposed in that manner. So there's just like a bunch of problems that we got to make sure we get ahead of as we go build this. And then also, I remember a couple of years ago, one of the last times we talked about this, we recognized that directives, if you just purely take the data in a directive and try to map it back out, then it ends up in a structure that's not always super helpful to consume. And so like, we got to make sure that we're exposing the data through introspection in a way that's reasonably easy to consume and solves problems that people have.
And that's a bit the shortcoming of this. Essentially, the values at the moment in this proposal are serialized as in a string, which is a GraphQL object, essentially. That's a bit a shortcoming of that approach. We follow that since now it would be a pity if we have multiple of these implementations, but that's kind of not so nice. And I think there was also Ivan's approach to have an extension point where you can essentially create a better output structure. Yeah. Because on GraphQL directives, we have essentially input data. And with that, we could form essentially better output data. But it allows for aligning GraphQL SDL and introspection. So essentially, you don't have a shortcutting. I agree with that. We internally have internal and external directives. So essentially, you have public directives that are exposed now, and you can mark them as internal in our server specification. But yeah.
We may want to consider that the other way around, just so that because right now the default behavior for anyone who doesn't implement something like this is that they're internal. And so if you all of a sudden expose all of them externally, that might be surprising in a way that yields security issues or some other kind of privacy leak.
To try to help, and from our perspective, we think this is really important. It's like a gap that we can't get the directives or some form of that kind of stuff over the introspection. But for your concern, Lee, somewhere up there in issue 300, I'd put a suggestion that like we have the repeatable word, that on directives you could put a keyword. I think I had exposed, and so then by default nothing's exposed, so it keeps backwards compatibility. You don't get surprises of everything going out. But that if you put one in your schema and you want to say like this is actually something I'm trying to expose, you say exposed on it, and then it would go out, right?
Yeah, we just thought about the same issue because there are users of Chocolate that have authentication directives where they essentially expose which group or which policy allows people to access something, and we didn't want to expose these automatically. That's why we have this internal. But yes,
I think it's really common. I think there are many directives which are how I do stuff on my back end, and it's nobody else's business. Exactly. But there are others where it's saying, I want to, it's the one mechanism there in the spec to kind of extend what I say about my schema beyond the things that are actually out there yet. So I might have something where I just say like, the extra information. So
this is great. This is exactly what I want to see is just to make sure that we are exploring the gamut of solutions, because I've also seen this proposed as like a metadata directive where the fields that you pass in can be structured out. I know Yvonne has variations of that idea too. We should just make sure that here's the problem at hand. Here's a handful of solutions going forward. Here's existing prototype implementations of some of those that exist in the ecosystem, so that we're like taking this as a problem-oriented approach that we can evaluate rather than narrowing in too soon on a particular solution just because some implementations are already following that prototype path. that'll give us a lot of confidence that we're not just like following a momentum, that we're actually approaching it from first principles.
Yeah, a few last comments. First, we actually let you filter out all directives like programmatically, because it's a valid concern. You don't want to expose all of them. I totally agree. The other thing is, because it's not officially spec, for example, we didn't go down the road and added a new syntax or new directives like repeatable or public. We didn't explicitly do it because this would have been gone too far in our heads to introduce something that is not spec compliant. You know, like that's a challenge. You want to do something which is not in the spec, so you're kind of limited, or you need to find your own way. The last thing, yeah.
No,
the last thing is, yeah, it's kind of, we follow the spec strictly overall, but this is simply an issue that came up too often and too much, and we also have, like, we as a maintainer, we have projects we want to expose certain directives. In terms of the problem, Lee, that you mentioned, it's metadata around schema, right? That's a problem. like we have information that are expressed in directives on a schema, and we have other toolings that want to process this or rely on this. This is the problem. And so it's like kind of, we don't want to go down this road and just implementing stuff, but this time we went down because we felt there was no choice.
And I don't mean to imply that doing this via exposing directives is a direction that I don't think will work. I just want to make sure that we don't omit other potential paths because we're like pre-sold on that particular path, and therefore miss something that might be worthwhile and help us lead to a better final solve.
Yeah, and also, I mean, in this particular case, we feature flag that because you have to opt in. And then you have these additional introspection fields that applied directives.
Nice.
And this way you can try it out. I mean, we can always walk that back when they, but that's why I say we need an RFC document like for input unions where we just can mingle.
That's the right next step here. So thank you, Michael, for volunteering to get that started. Hopefully between you and Andy, you can start to rope other people in who've built things around this. And that's the right way to move this particular one forward.
Just to put my hand up, I'm definitely also interested in this, so I can lend some time there, though I'm taking on quite a lot at the moment.
No, sorry, Benji, the boat is full. Sorry, Benji. It's too late. It's like...
How many cooks can we squeeze in this kitchen?
No, I think the more the merrier.
Amazing to see the support for getting this done.
Yeah, I also don't. I would have written some PR myself if I'd had time for it. I think it's really important, but I haven't had time, so I don't know how much time I'm volunteering. But I don't have many constraints. I want to see it. My interest is more that we want something standard. We need something that everybody's doing so we can use it. I've got fewer constraints on what I need out of it. But if I can't do it all, but I can help also. So just ping me.
That's excellent.
Oh, thank you very much.
All right, let's keep going. We've got the perennial topic of input union / one of. Benji, this one's back to you.
Yeah, I put this one at the end, which I thought, it's going to be a long one, so I'll put it at the end, but also I'm tired. Right. Okay, so input unions. We have discussed this a lot over the last, year and a half. We've gone around in circles a bit, and this is the latest write-up that I have for my solution, which is very broadly very similar to the first one that I raised, the one field directive, which was May 2019. So yeah, not far off 2 years now. So before we go into it, I just want to stress that this doesn't have to be a directive. At the moment, we have used a directive for the syntax because it means that I don't have to write spec edits to add additional syntax. But we may decide that the correct syntax for this is a keyword or some other alternative syntax form. And there are various proposals of those. So do not judge it as a directive, which is, I've heard a lot of things going, oh, anyway, whatever. Tired letting things out that I shouldn't be. So what this is a proposal that we introduce types to the GraphQL specification for input objects, for the fields on input objects and for arguments on output type fields that would allow us to say that exactly one of these things must be present. So for example, there must be exactly one field on an input object that is marked in this special way, whatever that may be, or that this particular field accepts exactly one argument. So you may have noticed in various schemas that there's not really a strongly typed way of doing this kind of thing at the moment. So for example, if you want to find a user within your system, you might do it using their GraphQL global object identifier, the ID. You might want to do it by their email address. You might want to do it by their username or by some combination of details you got from somewhere else, like an organization and a registration number or some other combination of things. And at the moment, how we generally model that in GraphQL is we add multiple fields for accessing these, one with each of the set of potential arguments. So what this proposal would allow is to be able to specify just one field, user, and say, here are 5 potential ways of finding them. It also allows us to deal with the input polymorphism that is desired for just representing polymorphic data in GraphQL as an input. So we commonly use PET as an example of this, but there are very broad categories of polymorphism that we may desire. Looking at GitHub, for example, like you could potentially treat issues and pull requests as a polymorphic input type. Looking at, say, Medium, you've got all the blocks in the document where you might have a paragraph block or an image block or a video block or a pull quote block. And those are different types of blocks that you would want to specify. And one thing to keep in mind is often these will actually take the form of a tree structure as well. So I imagine if you wanted to represent, say, a Trello board, you might do that as a nested structure of input, of polymorphic inputs. So we have come up with a whole bunch of different potential solutions for this problem. We have discussed them at length, both in the working group and also in the Input Union's sub-working group. And the one that is currently leading is this one, primarily because of its simplicity, because it doesn't take much, it doesn't change the GraphQL spec much, and it's relatively compatible with existing clients, which is an interesting side effect as well. What we are effectively doing is just taking the input type or the field that we already have and just flagging it in some way, just saying this is a one-off. And that gives us these new capabilities. So I have written up this RFC, I think in full, actually. I think I've pretty much laid out everything that I want to in the RFC. So there's probably going to be mistakes in there. There's certainly things to discuss. There's plenty of bike shedding to be done. But this is a full RFC that, if we all agreed with, could be merged in, I believe. So that's the state that I feel that this is at. So I wanted to make you all aware of this, tell you where we are, answer any questions that you may have, and so on and so forth. So please, any questions?
I have to say, I've find it much better than the attacked approach, because that had, I think, went too far. And this is much easier to implement. And what I like about is that you also can apply it on the arguments, like having one-off arguments, which I kind of think is nice.
I'm wondering if we actually want to, just in the sake of focusing it, to, now that we've explored the places where one of could go, focus it specifically on input objects rather than on fields. Like, use the exploration to know that if we were to expand it in more places, is the pattern potentially expandable? But I think we might be better off with a focused RC proposal to the actual spec text, especially since for arguments, there's like, and also another very reasonable short-term path here, which is to take an input object as a single argument and allow that input object to also have one of, which is a pattern that I know a lot of GraphQL APIs already use. And that's a completely reasonable schema design.
Yeah, the other challenge with arguments is that then you have to start figuring out how it works with variables and variable typing. You may end up like, if you have, could end up with one of at the variable level too, which is a whole other can of worms.
Don't you?
That's still a concern with input objects.
You can't, wait, can you put variables inside an input object?
Yeah. Yes, you can.
Oh, okay, cool. That's still a concern then. Well, we should figure that out, because I didn't think of that until just now, and I don't think the current version of the spec addresses it at all.
That's worth a test of some kind. But I need to parse through this particular RFC in more detail. My understanding from your description of it, Benji, is that it should solve it, because a one of input object is a different kind of input object in terms of its type rules. But I see what you mean in terms of, like, if you have variables for the different one ofs in that scenario, how does that work? I don't have an intuitive sense of how it should work.
You just have
So
to
just to give you a little, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think it just ends up being, you have to validate that only one of the variables is provided, which maybe you kind of get for free because the type system chains through like that, but maybe you don't, and we would have to check that.
It already works. So effectively, we differentiate between something being not present and something being null. And we can, I believe, carry that through. Yeah, we can carry that through the variable level. Well, I'm saying we can in GraphQL.js because I've done it. I've noticed that the thing is not there, even though I've got a variable for it. So by not specifying that variable, it comes through as if it was not specified on the object. I'm not sure if that's actually a GraphQL spec thing or just specifically how GraphQL.js works. So yeah, maybe more research is required there. But broadly, I think it's fine. And also, I have outlined, so you'll see that there's a table in the spec in section 3, around line 1638. There's effectively a spec of what the literal value is, what the variables are, and what the result of that should be. And you'll notice that that's directly below a very similar table that refers to input objects that actually, does it give the, yes, in fact, it shows you that the coerced value there for input objects, if a variable is not specified, is as if that key was not given. So that is already how it works, as we can see from that table.
I think where we'll have to have special care, and this might be space for us to actually go build some reference implementation code, is the variable validation rules, because you have to type your variables at the top of the query, and then your variables can appear within the body of those input objects. So are we confident we can have a scenario where we can appropriately type those variables and the types flow through?
Yeah,
because especially because if you have one of those fields and if you say this input object is a one of, then each independent field is now non-nullable. That implies that all of those variables also must be non-nullable. And you might end up in a situation where we require providing all of the variables.
Yeah, I just, as I was looking over this table, thank you, Benji. This was a great way to frame my thoughts. We're missing at least one case here, which I just left in a comment. So that we'll have to figure that out.
You're very right, Lee. That is definitely something that this has overlooked.
I don't have an intuitive sense of what the right behavior is, but we should dig into that.
Yes.
Aside from that, we both agree that this approach, everything but the syntax for it, which you very rightfully call out in that RFC, is completely up for bike shedding. Though I think leaning in the direction of using a directive is completely within line of how we've done this kind of thing in the past. Deprecated fields we represent as a directive. I see this as along similar lines. It's a property of that thing, but we use directives as a way to show that like syntax.
Like description also.
Description, yep, another great example. That's that one shows up as an inline string, but yeah.
Yeah. The deprecated was the right one. Yeah. Sorry.
I know we have a concept of a difference between non-nullable versus required in the context of variables. I'm blanking on exactly where we represent that in the spec or what the specific rules were, but I know that that's a thing.
I don't actually know if we have it for the concept of variables specifically, or if it's just for arguments and input fields, because variables they only have the one state. They only have the bang or not the bang, whereas arguments can be not provided or provided as explicit null or provided as an actual value.
They have default values. So difference between non-nullable and required is default value. Variables can have default values. In variable definition, you can write equals something. So,
and interestingly, in that case, they can still be nullable. So even if they've got a default value of, say, 7, you can still pass it as a null and it will come through as a null unless you declare it as like int bang equals 7. At least I believe that's the case.
Yeah, so if it's got a bang, then it's required. Or sorry, if it doesn't have a default value, then the bang means required or not. If it does have a default value, then the bang means nullable or not.
Yes.
Where required means can't be set to null. Explicitly.
Where required means the key has to be present in the input.
Well, a variable with a bang without a default value can also not be explicitly set to null.
Correct.
So
maybe
there's definitely
confusing.
Like the way we do default values definitely conflates things, especially because if you have a default value for a nullable, for a value without a bang, you can use that in an argument that takes a non-nullable value. So like, if I have a field that requires ID, I have ID, $ID equals ID, or $ID : capital ID equals 123, technically it becomes it becomes an execution time failure at the field call site when I set, rather than at the query site, when I set that $ID to be null.
Wait, that's not a schema time. That's an execution time error.
Yeah.
God. Okay.
Because we don't know that schema.
Because
I thought that was just.
It's not validation, right?
We basically allowed, it's this required to be set versus nullable conflation that default values kind of, the nullable optional case is allowed to be used in arguments that are required and not nullable.
That's terrible, but somehow not surprising.
The entire topic is like terrible. What?
There are also some things in the validation about that are terrible, because there is a competing validation rule about the type and the I don't remember it anymore, but I talked about that with Ivan, if you remember.
Yeah. So like return back to original discussion. It's a question: do we need to allow people to specify unpacked input unions? Because there is no problem with packed one. So if you use variable with cat and dog, variable of input union type, everything is okay. You just need to, inside JSON, you just need to put cat, dog, cat, fish. And it's a question. It would be nice to support unpacked one, but is it a big issue or not in general?
That's the right question. You could go as far as to say, if you just like make that illegal, right? If an input object is of a type 1 of, then you can't put variables inside it. I don't know if that's going too far or not. It's certainly a blunt hammer to solve the problem. You just make the potential case go away. I think actually the crux of this is the type changing behavior of you specify the field as non-nullable, but through the introduction of the one of modifier, the types all of a sudden become non-nullable, which independent of this particular variable issue, I already was a little bit wary of this behavior.
Sorry, I mentioned I was tired. This is all wrong. We've required the inner one of, I have thought about this and I have solved it and it's all fine. Yay. Inner one of object, every field must be nullable. So it is required that the fields are all nullable. So non-nullability isn't a concern. All the variables have to then be, or would then be non-nullable. Actually, you could make a variable non-nullable so long as you only provide one of them. And then effectively the coercion then applies the non-nullability constraint on the one provided key. So everything is non-nullable except for the one that you give.
So there's a difference. I mean, this is still quirky, right? And we should, the thing that I think is the weakest point of the proposal so far, and maybe that's just where we have to settle it, is there's a difference between the static time type and the runtime type. So the static time type says these are nullable, and the runtime type says that they are in fact not nullable.
Yes, and it's a coercion concern.
But also that would not allow to set one of them, just one of them to zero, to null. there could also be a case that you want to set something to null, but just this one field. I mean, one-off is about setting one of them, not to which value.
One of them is, I've been very explicit in the definition of it, that effectively it's one field and that field is non-null. So I am not planning to represent the case of this, that you specify one field and that field is null. That's not a desired use case. Effectively, there is one non-null value and every other value is omitted.
That works around this problem.
I think we will have to be especially careful. There's a assumption being made based on the current validation rules around variables and their placement within input objects, that because we validate that the variable type is at equal or more specific than the placement that you find it, that therefore you should be able to take those values and flow them through without coercion. Or rather, you should coerce them at the beginning of the query time against their variable definitions. And at that point, because they are equal or more specific, it is safe to blindly pass them through without a second coercion. So for example, you've got your cat variable that's non-null and your dog variable that's non-null, and you're passing both of them into this input object. And if you pass null to both of those two, then it will pass the first phase, and then you'll pass those variables into the next phase, and you'll have to have a reconciliation step at that point to actually check the values of those variables that you've provided, which I think is an extra step. So you might have already accounted for that, but that seems like part of the fiddly edge and corner case. But maybe just to back up, I think my recommendation here stands, which is we got to go write some real code and write a bunch of unit tests against this. And this is one of those scenarios where you write the spec text to inform the code, and then you read the code and you rewrite the spec text based on what the code does to make sure that we actually have accounted for all of these cases. Because I think we are live generating a ton of very useful unit tests, and then are now struggling to like live evaluate our unit tests against spec text. Which is fun, but it's hurting our brains in the third hour of the meeting.
Yeah. Yeah. In summary, though, I think all of these concerns are already addressed in the current RFC, and I believe, back to what I said before, I think it is technically mergeable. So I'm happy to start progressing this, but I would love some reads of the RFC to make sure that I've not missed anything. But yeah, I'm generally happy with it.
But what did we say now? Are we just applying it on input objects, or are we keeping it working on arguments?
My suggestion here is, while we're in exploration mode, to keep their exploration broad so that we don't find ourselves designed into a corner. But when it comes time to actually scope out a late stage RFC, to keep it specific. Because I'm a little bit concerned about the surface area of change.
Okay.
That makes sense to me. I'm happy to merge them in 2 stages. I think the arguments, I mean, as we know, arguments and input objects are very similar. So the differences are quite slight, but smaller changes are better. My main concern, I guess, at this time is, what syntax should we use? And if we're only going to use this with input objects, like in the end, and we're never going to use it with arguments, then it may make more sense to use a custom syntax. I have been consistent in the RFC to call these one of input objects and one of fields. So I do call them as if they are a different type. So putting a keyword there would make a lot of sense. Though in introspection, they are definitely represented as the same thing. So that should also be clear, and doing it with a directive actually makes a lot of sense from that point of view, in a similar way that deprecation does. So syntax is definitely a question. If we were to extend this to arguments, as I have done in the RFC, one of my concerns that I have is that the directive that you apply to the field is effectively applying to the arguments. It's saying there's one of the arguments, but you actually apply it to the field. So it goes after the type definition of the field, which actually removes it from the context of where it actually kind of applies. And I'm not super happy with that, but also I couldn't justify any of the alternative syntaxes at this stage. If we want to continue this with an input objects only and then potentially add arguments later, that's something that we need to address now, even though we're not actually going to implement it. Because if we decide that we find the one-of directive to be unpleasant and actually undesirable for arguments, then we don't want to use it for input objects either. So it kind of needs resolving, even though we may not actually include it in the final RFC. So as Lee says, it's still an exploration at this stage. I definitely like input on that. And if you have interest in the syntax, I have laid out a document with a bunch of different syntaxes that have been proposed, some by myself, some by Ivan or Lee. If you have alternative syntaxes that you think are better or should even just be considered, hit me up. Love to hear them.
Two thoughts for you. One relevant to what we're talking about, one that unfortunately circles back on our previous conversation. And I promise I will keep that one tight so we don't revisit or relitigate that. So first, this is part of the reason why I want us to kind of separate the one argument for one field. I'm a little nervous that in an attempt to solve both, we weaken the power for its primary use case, which is for the input objects. And like from a practical point of view, if you decided calling this one field is more clear, or maybe one of is fine, but in the arguments case, you want to call it one argument such that the directive name doesn't align, maybe that's fine. Maybe we have like two directives that describe similar behaviors, but are slightly different. And in fact, it might actually be worthwhile to clarify like this actually, these yield out slightly different behaviors, and it's worth, you know, treating them as slightly different things, similar, related, but different. So that's one kind of thought. Another is I might have a better solve to this directive shenanigans, which is this rule that one of object bodies must have exactly one field within them. If we apply that to literals, then this problem goes away as well, which is to say, maybe it's a rehashing of what Yvonne was suggesting, but it just, I think, makes it a bit more crisp. That if you see, you know, your pet input object, one of input objects, and you see it spelled out with cat colon something, dog colon something, that should just be an immediate hard validation error, regardless of whether those things are values or variables, because you're seeing two fields in a one of, and don't do that. And that limits our ability to put variables a layer deeper in there, but it also circumvents that entire landmine problem. And so that might be a way to do that. That doesn't apply for one argument. So one argument, you buy that problem right back where you could put multiple variables in your arguments, but it at least solves it for the field problem, and maybe all the more reason to narrow focus down.
Okay, that is not a desirable solution for me. I would rather not implement that, and I don't support that approach.
Fair enough.
I like the idea though. It is a cunning way of solving the problem. But no, I'm already, we have the situation with variables where when you specify them as part of input objects, the variables can still differentiate between not present and null.
Yeah.
And I think we should just continue that through. I see no reason to break that and to add the additional code that is required to break that, and to then explain to people over and over again why we broke that. like once it's out in the wild. I'd rather it just behaved the same broadly.
Seems reasonable. Do we feel like we have clear next steps and feedback collected, concerns raised? Syntax, I don't think we should live bike shed syntax. That we should bike shed syntax, but we should do that in a place where we can write out code and evaluate it, which is in the context of that RFC.
100% agree.
Thank you for your hard work on this, Benji. I know we've been working this space for a long time and followed many paths and snipped them all off and have come back to this path. So it's giving us a lot of confidence that we were in the right direction, even though there's still a couple problems left to solve. I've marked this one as proposal, RFC1, just so that we keep track of it.
Cool, sounds good. So I guess primarily the next steps are people contribute. What do you think of the syntax? What do you think of the RFC text itself? Please let me know. And then a further action item on me, which is to actually write an implementation of this against GraphQL.js, which, yeah, not sure when I'll get around to that, but we've already been working on this for 18 months. So, you know, we've got a while, I guess.
That's right. Better to get it done right than done fast in a scenario where we have to live with it forever. That's our last topic on the agenda. Anything else we need to cover or announce before we wrap up for the day?
I just wanted to comment that I don't think I got around to filing the action items from last month. So there's probably going to be quite a few when we file these ones, just to let you know that some things may have slipped off the radar.
No problem. Huge thanks to you for doing that every month. So just very much appreciate it. All right, folks. Go ahead, Evan.
We're going to be cutting a spec soon. There are still a few of those action items that need to make it into that spec.
Okay. Feel free to proactively tag those before Benji gets them if you want. I'm going to be reviewing those over the next week or two. Cool. All right, everyone. Action-packed meeting. Thanks all for sticking it out. It's always been entertaining. Good to hang with this whole group as always. See you again next month.
Goodbye, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Yeah.
Yeah.